Hi, everyone. This is Phil Travis, and this week's lesson is on détente, the period in the 1970s ushered in by Richard Nixon, carried through by Gerald Ford as well as Jimmy Carter, in which we see a sort of relaxing of the tensions of the Cold War, in which we see the United States and the Soviet Union come together through some landmark diplomatic agreements. And of course, it's also the period in which the United States takes the steps towards recognizing the Communist government of China as the legitimate government of China. Remember, remember, the Chinese government, by the United States standpoint, was a government that was in a rebellion. It was not a legitimate government. The United States had supported Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang nationalists. And of course, they were defeated in 1949 and they were pushed off mainland China to Taiwan. And from 1949, literally until the mid-later 70s, the United States recognized Taiwan as the legitimate government of China. In the 1970s, under détente, you see Nixon visiting China. You see ultimately, after Nixon, you see the United States recognizing the government in Beijing as the legitimate government of China, and ultimately setting the stage for a very, very sophisticated economic relationship that would exist and still obviously exists today between the United States and China. That in the 1980s, under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, really sort of transformed their economy, and they became, while they are not a democracy and they're still ruled by a communist party, it's a non-democratic society, but it is centered largely around global capitalism. And this has brought some environmental issues in China, but it's also made China a world power economically, and also a rising world power militarily, which under the time of Mao, like in communist Russia, Mao had used a number of planned economic plans and social purges in China during his time as premier. And China really had not yet emerged as this world economic power, but it's in the context of détente that they do. So, détente generally refers to a lessening of tension in the Cold War. But oftentimes, détente is considered to mean different things for the United States and the Soviet Union. For the United States, speaking from somebody whose specialty is U.S. international relations, the United States generally perceived détente as a lessening of tension in the Cold War, and a possible end to the Cold War. For the Soviet Union, sometimes it can be described as a breather or an uncocking of the gun. So there's some different perspectives on what it means. What it is a series of political trade agreements, weapons agreements between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that create a more friendly coexistence. And of course, pictured here, you see Richard Nixon with Leonid Brezhnev. And Leonid Brezhnev, the premier of the Soviet Union. Richard Nixon, of course, the United States president. And they're here at Camp David. And you can tell by looking at the picture that Nixon and Brezhnev are quite jovial together. Nixon and Brezhnev actually had probably the most cordial relationship that any American president and Soviet leader had. And this relationship between the two really facilitated the development of détente. The United States, and I'll get into the examples here in just a second, but the United States really had a reason to come to the table with the Soviet Union and had a desire to. The United States very much believed that success in places like Vietnam and stability in the world would happen through improved relations with the Soviet Union. And so that really helps. Nixon really kind of led the way towards détente in the 1970s. The Roots of Détente, and this is Gerald Ford and Leonid Brezhnev signing the SALT agreement, the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement with Leonid Brezhnev. The roots of détente are really rooted in the 1960s, though I think you could argue that they're also in the 1950s, of course, with Khrushchev's efforts at de-Stalinization, and these types of things. Khrushchev's concept of peaceful coexistence, of course, ultimately the Cold War actually escalated during that time period. So, in terms of actual palpable agreements that were taking steps towards improving relations, it's hard to say that it happened before the Cuban Missile Crisis was concluded. The roots, when you talk about the détente being a series of agreements that between the United States and the Soviet Union to create lessening of tensions, to create sort of peaceful coexistence, the roots are really in the 60s. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and the Soviet Union installed the so-called red telephone, which was a direct link, a direct line between the United States and the Soviet Union. And this was because during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and the USSR, Khrushchev and Kennedy, it was very difficult for them to convey. They had to write memorandums to each other. It was very difficult for either of them to convey their position in an immediate way. And that was very problematic because it left both sides kind of guessing on what would happen. And when you're talking about a potential nuclear confrontation, guessing is not desirable. So after that, both countries agreed to install a direct line so that in times of crisis, they would be able to have direct communications and direct negotiations. And Nixon uses that direct link quite effectively. During the negotiations over the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon had cordial conversations with the foreign minister Gromyko and, of course, Leonid Brezhnev over Vietnam. Nixon sought very much to use détente, to use an improved relationship with the Soviet Union to help achieve what he would call peace with honor in Vietnam. The U.S. under Kennedy and the Soviet Union also signed the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty in 1963 after the detonation in the open air of hundreds of nuclear weapons by the U.S. and the Soviet Union, some of which were 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Both the Soviet Union and the United States had agreed to ban atmospheric testing, which was a huge step in the right direction. And then eventually the signing of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to prevent the expansion of weapons were all the roots of détente. And détente really comes to fruition with the presidency of Richard Nixon and also the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev. And the primary agreements were, the first ones were the SALT agreement. SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Agreements. And there were two of them, and the first one passes and was signed by both countries, and the second one was on the table, almost ready to be signed when the Soviets finally decided in December of 1979 to invade Afghanistan, after which point it fell apart. The SALT agreements were strategic arms limitation agreements, meaning that they were limitations on nuclear weapons. So SALT agreements were designed to limit the further development of nuclear weapons by the United States and the Soviet Union. The second SALT agreement, which wasn't signed, was particularly linked to the development of MIRVs, or multiple reentry vehicles. Modern nuclear missiles oftentimes have as many as 8 and 10 different warheads contained in each missile. And so a nuclear missile by the 1970s could be fired at a target, or fired at 8 different targets, because it would have 8 different reentry vehicles when they reenter the atmosphere, and they were able to target different cities or military installations. The Soviets were behind on that type of technology, and the United States were really on the cutting edge of developing the best and most efficient and most accurate nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union very much found it in their interest to try to limit developments of things like MIRVs, because it was a potential threat to the USSR, which had technologically fallen behind the United States. Another component was the ABM Treaty. The ABM Treaty stands for the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And that was a key portion of the SALT talks and the SALT agreement, because the idea here was that in order to have a nuclear arms limitation treaty actually work, both countries had to agree not to build a nuclear missile defense system. And this is why you can see why Reagan's Star Wars program was so controversial to Gorbachev, because it violated the ABM treaty. But by doing this, the idea was if both countries refused to develop an anti-ballistic missile system, then it meant that both would remain vulnerable to mutually assured destruction if they both continued to cut back their weapons. So the idea is that if you didn't have this, then you could cut back your weapons, but if one country was able to master an anti-ballistic missile system, then that would mean that theoretically they could launch a first strike against you, but be able to largely defend against your response strike. And so they wanted to have this anti-ballistic missile treaty set in place so that neither side would try to do that. Because if one side did that, then the natural reaction of the side that didn't have the missile defense system would be to build as many nuclear weapons as you could so that you could override the system. And so they wanted to prevent that. They wanted to stop the nuclear arms race. Détente developed further under the presidency of Gerald Ford. Of course, Leonid Brezhnev was premier throughout the 1970s. Of course, Nixon did many good things as president. Actually, Détente was one of his great claims to fame in international relations. He created the path to opening the door with China. He actually spearheaded the creation of OSHA, the EPA. He increased welfare benefits to dependent children. He was, in a lot of ways, he did some things that were progressive. He also, of course, was very corrupt, and he had to control everything. And, of course, his corruption led to his downfall. And you can't have, when you think about Nixon, the corruption comes with Nixon. So, you can't have Nixon without the corruption. But he did do some positive things for the United States and the Cold War. Well, after he's gone, after Watergate results in his, departure from office, Gerald Ford becomes president. And the United States had finally seen an end to Vietnam. Of course, Nixon's attempts at peace with honor had failed. And in 1975, Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese offensive. Of course, the United States military had been out since 1973, and in practical purposes, even before that. But it was a huge crushing blow to the United States, the fall of Saigon, which we're just past the 40th anniversary, by the way. The U.S. economy was in a lot of trouble. There was an OPEC oil embargo in the United States that very much hurt the consumer economy in the United States, and ironically helped the Soviet economy. I say ironic because the OPEC nations were not necessarily, they weren't doing this in a concerted effort with the Soviet Union, but OPEC's embargo in the United States, which was largely a response to the United States' strong alliance with Israel in the Arab-Israeli wars of the early 1970s and late 60s, the OPEC oil embargo actually created a boom for Russian oil as it affected oil prices and allowed the Soviet Union to make greater profits on the oil trade that it had a monopoly on in Eastern Europe, just like today when you think about Russia's interest in the oil trade. Of course, in the United States, you had a uniquely distrustful populace. The United States was very much not interested in the Cold War and very much interested in bringing it to an end effectively. And this helped lead to Gerald Ford signing the Helsinki Accords. The Helsinki Accords were designed to do the following. They were designed to get the Soviet Union to become less of a human rights violator. Of course, the Soviet Union is countered about, United States' involvement with the overthrow of the government of Salvador Allende and the military dictatorships in Central America. So it was kind of a back and forth. I say sound familiar because it's sort of like, well, you've got missiles in Turkey, we'll put them in Cuba. Sorry about that, guys. My phone just went off. But it was kind of, it sounds kind of familiar because it's this back and forth that the Soviet Union had been doing for a while, because both the United States and the Soviet Union had been engaged in, very aggressive and controversial style counterinsurgency activities within the developing world. We both had played a role in trying to manipulate governments. And so the United States calls on the Soviet Union and the Helsinki Accords to improve their human rights record. The Soviets, of course, had a countering shot, but ultimately the Soviets will agree to the Helsinki Accords. And basically the Helsinki Accords connected to grain shipments, Soviet promises to improve their human rights records. The United States would recognize effectively portions of the Eastern European zone of the Soviet Empire. Those were governments that were independent, but they were governments that were effectively under the sway of Soviet influence. The USSR would allow greater migrations of Jewish people. There was a great deal of problems with persecution of Jewish people in Russia, and many Jewish people wanted to leave, and the Russians prevented many migrants from leaving the country. The United States and the Soviet Union also participated in a joint space mission, the Apollo-Soyuz project, which was a joint test mission that kind of symbolized the possibility of détente and the possibility of using space as a place where which there could be greater cooperation and less hostility between the two. But the Helsinki Agreement really became the next big step in détente, and it was largely, it was criticized heavily in the United States because a lot of people said in the United States that basically we were recognizing Soviet influence in Poland, but all we were getting in return were Soviet promises. And the Soviets, from their perspective, from many hawks' perspective in the United States, the promises of the Soviet Union were, a little bit hard to take at times. So there was a lot of people that were very concerned that the promises of human rights, improving human rights records, and these types of things were just promises, and that the United States couldn't account on a lot of this stuff. So it was the Helsinki Accords were controversial in the United States. The Soviet Union needed grain from the United States, and so we make those grain shipments contingent on human rights improvements. And so both sides see it as them getting something out of it, but it really embodies détente. Of course, there's still a problem with détente, right? The U.S. and the USSR still have nuclear weapons aimed at each other. And in fact, the positioning of things like U.S. Pershing missiles in West Germany, Soviet missiles in their sphere, were quite hostile. Pershing missiles were put in Germany in the 1970s, and those were very hostile moves given the progress towards détente. The U.S. and the USSR were also still competing quite intensely over the developing world. The United States, after Vietnam, under the leadership of Ford and Carter, tries to scale back its involvement in the developing world. The United States very much wanted to back away from the Cold War, but the Soviet Union continued through countries like Cuba to aggressively promote its position in the promotion of its sphere of influence in the developing world. There was a war in Angola in which Cuba was increasingly involved. In Latin America, the United States were supporting hardline leaders, and the Cubans and the Soviets were looking to encourage revolutionaries who fashioned themselves in the guise of Fidel Castro. The U.S. and the USSR were vying for influence in the developing world still. And while the United States' activity scales back a little bit after the fall of Saigon and the end of Vietnam, this trend remains true. And of course, in the 1980s, the Cold War really becomes very, very hot, meaning a shooting war in the developing world, particularly in places like Central America. And of course, the United States' indirect involvement to try to counter the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that happens in December of 1979. So we're making steps towards détente. Helsinki Accords, promises to improve human rights, the Apollo-Soyuz project, SALT, ABM, promises on Jewish migration, grain deliveries. Nixon and Brezhnev are buddied up and they're friends, it seems like, but there's still some big problems that in a lot of ways will promise that détente falls apart. And probably the biggest factor in détente falling apart was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The Soviets had promised Carter in 1978 that they wouldn't do this, but as the war became more intense and as those that sought affiliation with the Soviet Union and Afghanistan increasingly encouraged Soviet help, the Soviets finally felt that they had to intervene. And it was that moment that Carter felt betrayed, and you really saw the détente fall apart. There's also issues in the USSR in the 1970s. So I want to finish up briefly mentioning some of the issues for the Soviet Union during détente. The by the end of the next decade, in 1989, of course, we'll see the Berlin Wall come down, and of course, in 1990, of course, the world will watch as the Soviet Union, shockingly to many, collapsed. And so, Americans have always questioned this. To what degree, or we've always considered this, to what degree were the policies of American leaders in the Cold War responsible for the end of the Cold War? And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we discuss Reagan. But was the Cold War ended because of the United States' policy in the Cold War? Or did the Cold War come to an end because of fundamental issues within the Soviet Union? So we'll consider that issue more in depth next week when we talk about the 1980s and Reagan. But it should be noted that there were some really, really significant issues for the USSR in the 1970s. Leonid Brezhnev, pictured here, experienced some really serious health issues. He was getting older. In general, the government was kind of made up of the old guard. Mikhail Gorbachev was I think he was 51 years old at this time in the 70s, early 70s, and he was viewed as a young person. So the government in the Soviet Union really suffered from what some scholars might call gerontocracy. It was ruled by a very old, sort of nostalgic old guard that, in one respect, in the case of Brezhnev, was not only was he experienced failing health, but these individuals also were not inclined to reform a broken system. And so they continued to advance collectivized agricultural programs even as they failed. And increasingly, as a result of this, you start to see a dissatisfaction within the Soviet Union. There's no consumer economy to speak of in the Soviet Union. There's tension within the area of Eastern Europe, within the area of the Greater Warsaw Pact. And these tensions, of course, will begin to boil over into the movements for independence that really began in earnest in the late 80s and early 90s, when Gorbachev begins reform in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is falling behind technologically on the United States. They were reliant also on grain deliveries from the United States. There were some real issues with the way the Soviet system was being run by the sort of old guard in the Soviet Union. And the lack of an ability to reform really created some significant political and economic problems in the Soviet Union that, of course, Gorbachev will try to reform in the 1980s, but when Gorbachev begins the process of reform, particularly the encouragement of democratization in the various states of the Soviet Empire, it really unfurled in full-scale independence movements as people sort of reacted from their dissatisfaction with the Soviet government, as well as the failures of Soviet policy, and of course the perspective in some cases, in places like Poland, the idea that they were, imperialized by the Soviet Union as well, which was a widely held sentiment in most of those Eastern European countries. Okay, I hope this is helpful. Let's have a great week.